Hello and welcome everyone to ICPSR's Love Data Week. My name is Anna Ovchinnikova. I'm the data project manager for National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture, funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. Also here today with me is Lynette Poulter. Lynette is NADAC's director. We're both delighted to have you join us today for this presentation. Arts production in the era of crowdfunding. Introduction to data from the Kickstarter platform. I now would like to give a warm welcome to our presenters, John Leland and Doug Noonan. John is the Vice President of Insights and head of the Environmental Impact Group at Kickstarter, where he oversees research to inform, assess, and drive product and marketing strategy across the company. John also manages Kickstarter's data and analytics infrastructure. Doug Noonan is the Paul H. O'Neill Professor at the O'Neill School at IUPUI. Doug's research focuses on a variety of policy and economics issues related to the cultural affairs, urban environments, neighborhood dynamics, and quality of life. He's currently the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cultural Economics, co-founder and faculty director of the Center for Cultural Affairs at the Indiana University, and in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts, co-director of the Arts, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation Lab. Here's a high-level agenda for today's webinar. We'll start with John telling us about Kickstarter and the Kickstarter data, and then Doug will discuss applications of Kickstarter data and empirical research and promising questions and avenues for new research that one could pursue using these types of data. We'll end with answering your questions, but like I mentioned before, please feel free to submit those using Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom window anytime during today's presentation. And without further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Okay, that should work. Great, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to talk to you a bit about what Kickstarter is and a bit about the data that we're sharing. So Kickstarter, as you probably know if you're here, is a crowdfunding platform for creative projects specifically. That means that creators, and on the platform, creators launch what we call a project. So this is sort of important terms here that sort of shape our data. Creators launch a project to raise money from what we call backers. So the backers are putting money into these campaigns, or really what we call projects. You can see in purple here on a project page or a campaign page, you have a number of backers and you have a single creator, which is what's boxed here in red. Every project on the platform has a funding goal, which you can see boxed in red here. That must be met in a campaign window, which you can see boxed in purple here. That window will be 1 to 60 days. 60 days is the limit. Although if you go back to the beginning of Kickstarter, at the beginning it was 90 days actually. We cut that down at some point very early on, 2012 or 2013, I think. But you have to hit that goal in order to receive the funding. So Kickstarter, unlike actually all other crowdfunding platforms, really has this all or nothing model where you set that goal, you have your timeline. Usually it's 30 days, it's the most popular choice. In your 30 days, if you raise from backers enough money to hit that goal or go beyond it, then at the end of the campaign, everyone gets charged, the transaction happens, the creator receives their funds. If they are unable to hit that target during the campaign window, then nothing happens. No backers get charged, no money changes hands, nothing happens at all. So it creates this mechanism of sort of success failure as a binary. We do that to protect both creators and backers because the relationship that's being set up between creators and backers is for reward. And every project, let's go back to this, every project, backers are pledging to receive something. It's a promise to receive something, usually from the project. And if the creator is saying, I need $15,000 to execute on this project, and they only raise $5,000 from a bunch of people they've promised to execute on this project for, they don't have the money to do it, but they do have money from all these people. So we want to protect people from making promises they can't deliver on. To be a creative project on Kickstarter, projects must create something to share with others. That is sort of the basic requirement, but it also must fit within one of our 15 categories. You can see the categories listed here: art, comics, dance, design, fashion, film, music, games, journalism, technology, theater. So these range from traditional arts to stuff that might be more in the design consumer space, or board games is a massive part of our ecosystem right now. Every campaign may also, doesn't have to, but may also select one of our 161 subcategories. And these are kind of all over the place. Every top level category has its own set of subcategories that creators can choose from for their project. And they range from, bacon to knitting to poetry. It's all over the place. But creators don't have to choose a subcategory. As I said, backers usually pledge to a project in exchange for a reward, although they can choose not to. You can pledge for no reward. That's an option of just giving your money to creators. Different categories have different rates of people doing that, which probably line up, as you would expect, the more kind of commercial or consumer the relationship is. So if you're backing for a board game, you probably want that board game. But if you're pledging to a mural project or a dance performance, you may not care as much about receiving a reward for that. You just want to support that creator, that artist. Since 2009, we've had 425,000 creators have launched 500,000 projects on the platform and received support from 20 million backers. Those 20 million backers have pledged over $6 billion, which has successfully funded over 200,000 projects. So not quite half of all the projects that have launched. And those projects have successfully raised about a little more than $5.8 billion. Right? So most of the money that's pledged on the platform, you can tell, goes into successfully funded campaigns. Most of the projects that fail to fund raise between 0 and 20% of their goal. They're kind of trees in a forest that fall without making too much of a noise. The largest project on our platform raised over $20 million. That was the second Pebble campaign, which was a smartwatch kind of precursor to the Apple Watch. It raised it from 78,000 backers. But the median successfully funded project is quite small. So it raises just $5,000 from 77 backers. So all of the volume is sort of in these small projects, which again, run the gamut. In terms of breakdown amongst launched projects, film, games, music, and publishing have the most launched projects on the platform, though the balance between these categories has definitely shifted significantly over time. And most projects have been launched from the US, although there are a number of other countries that folks launch from. And we aren't available in every country. If people have questions about that, I can answer those questions. We are sharing right now a couple data sets that are public. The project data set has basically all of our projects funded and unfunded between 2009 and 2020. The features there are project title, project category and subcategory, their location, including just the city and state and country, the funding goal in original and US amounts, the pledged amount in dollars, and the number of backers on that project. Then we also have a backer location data set that includes the total amount pledged for each geographic location by country and state. There is an additional restricted data set that is being made available that has more specific information on sort of creators and backers. I think academics tend to look at this data set and they just look at all the numbers. So I want to give you some flavor before handing it over to some more number analysis. The Kickstarter projects are wild. It is a crazy ocean of creativity. They are beautiful. So here's a few. Meow Wolf Art Complex, which I really want to go to, is just like a psychedelic indie warehouse Disneyland space outside of Santa Fe, which it's just like a massive complex that probably feels like you're on LSD if you go in there. From everything I've seen, I would really like to go. You've got things like Minecraft, which is a beautiful project. It's in, actually was acquired by MoMA, and is a kind of roving mine detector, like detonator, that just roams deserts and acts like a tumbleweed that's setting off mines. And then That Dragon Cancer, which is really one of the most beautiful but heartbreaking campaigns in my tenure. It also speaks to what Kickstarter is. So That Dragon Cancer is a video game developed by an independent designer who lost his 5-year-old son to cancer. And the video game is about that experience of losing his son to cancer. That is the sort of thing that no video game company is ever going to fund, right? But it is so important that that kind of work gets made, because it doesn't fit inside traditional concepts of what makes money, what should get made. And this is precisely why we exist, is that we think people should be able to have ideas like this that don't have avenues in traditional forms of funding and putting creative work out into the world, and ask the world to help them make it real. These projects are also strange. There's a lot of weirdness in here as well. If you want to go, it's the internet. You've got like Love Turtle Hat guy up there, top left. Just a sweet old man making turtle hats. Very enthusiastic about it. He raised, let me see here, he raised $30,000 for his turtle hats. It's just like delightful. You've got butts. You're going to see a spectrum of not safe for work content. This was a kind of cheeky version of that. Yeah. Which is actually a live campaign. I just stumbled across it. And then potato salad, which actually, if you're working with our data, you need to just keep in mind, because potato salad ruined our data. Potato salad was a campaign launched just sort of, I think, basically a stoned thought from a kid in Cincinnati. It was a $10 goal to just make a potato salad. And he raised $55,000. Yeah. So sometimes, we exist on the internet, and sometimes the internet takes you for a ride. And the internet took us for a ride, where people thought it'd be really funny to pour money into this potato salad project that someone launched just for no reason. Zach was great about it. He was like on the Today Show. It got tons of press and coverage, which is how something, went viral. And he was great about it. He launched a music festival in Cincinnati where they were just serving giant vats of potato salad and feeding the homeless, and it was great. But it did lead to a lot of exposure for the site, a lot of misunderstanding what Kickstarter is, a lot of feeling like maybe this is just a magical money fairy, that if you put up a terrible idea for potato salad or barbecue, that people will hand you $55,000, which obviously isn't what happened, but it led to a spike in launched projects, but not really in successful projects. It was basically just like we got flooded with garbage. So you can see that in the data starting in July 2014. Had a long tail effect. And then, you see this all over the place, but Kickstarter projects just have like a much bigger impact than what you can see in the data set. And that can, certainly we've had some major companies start on the platform. Peloton started on the platform, Allbirds, Oculus Rift, all of, there's a bunch of $1 billion plus companies that got started on Kickstarter. We don't get a cut of this, otherwise I would be calling you from a much fancier place than this. But you also have cultural things that just like have the seed get started here. So Fleabag, if you're familiar with the, I want to say Netflix series, I'm not sure if that's right, but it's like a critically acclaimed, very popular television show, got started with a very small campaign, 4,000 pounds from 54 backers, so that Fleabag could go to the Fringe Festival, which is where it got started. So you just have like these long tail, long-term cultural impacts from these things that have their genesis on Kickstarter. And there's plenty of films, albums, Grammy-nominated, Oscar-winning stuff that has just emerged out of pretty small, modest campaigns on Kickstarter that you don't know it when it's coming through the platform, because you get these things so early in their life cycles, but then go on to have these lives in the real world. So have fun. It's explore the weirdness of all of it. you'll see a bunch of weird stuff. Animal Meditations is one of my projects, so check that one out. Because that's the sort of, you can also launch projects on Kickstarter. So, you know, Animal Meditations is a really small, weird project that would not exist if it wasn't for 265 people that most of whom I didn't know being like, yeah, I want you to record meditations or what it would be like to be a sloth eating a leaf. And that's the beauty of Kickstarter. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you, John. That was great. Awesome. Now it's Doug's turn.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the setup. This is going to put a lot of color and flavor in what I want to share here. So I want to talk a bit about the data and some of the applications, what you can do with this. And I'm going to whip through a bunch of slides. Later, you get the recording, you can hit pause and see what I was really talking about. You can put some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to go through a lot pretty quickly. We've already done the introductions part, so I can skip past sort of who I am, but I need to start then with a big thanks. This is what this to me is all about, is my chance to say thank you to John Leland and to Kickstarter for actually making the data available. This is a beautiful day. This is a beautiful thing for me. As someone who's been using Kickstarter data for the better part of a decade now, I cherish the day that now that Kickstarter is making this data more broadly available and actually making it better. So this is a wonderful repository. And also thanks to ICPSR and to the National Endowment for the Arts for helping to make this possible, also for helping to let me and supporting my research and let me dig into this kind of world, because it is wild and creative and wacky. But I also firmly believe it's not all that weird. I think maybe it's just reflecting how weird we really are as a people and a society. And so I think we don't have enough windows into that part of the world, and Kickstarter and their data provide us a really interesting window into it. So thank you to everyone for making this all possible. What I want to talk about now is to talk a little bit about the data as I see it that's coming out or that is already out. There's both. There's the public use stuff that's out now, I understand, and then the restricted use will be imminent. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then I want to give some examples of quantitative empirical research using this kind of data, and then raise some questions at the end, but then hopefully also be able to answer a couple of questions that might come up from the attendees. So what are these data? Breaks down, as far as I can tell, into two different big data sets. There's the Kickstarter project data set and the backer location data. The Kickstarter project part, as John already mentioned, there's the public use part, and then the restricted use that adds in the text blurb, sort of the subtitle for the project, some name and URL name fields that aren't in the public use one. And then there's this backer location data set, as well as a separate and novel piece of data out there. So we're looking at 500,000 data points just in the project's data set, which is really exciting to me. I think he listed that there were 150 something subcategories. And as I'll mention later, when you combine subcategories with categories, there's a lot of different variation in these groups. Everything from taxidermy and chiptune all the way out to board games and product design and other bigger categories. We're going to get information in here on the project's location, the dates of the project for its start date and its end date, the goal, the dollar goal it had, and its pledged amounts that it's actually able to accumulate, and then the number of backers. So really core essential data when it comes to analyzing what's going on with Kickstarter. It takes a lot of the flavor out without the text fields, but not entirely. There's still actually a little bit of flavor in here that's interesting. You look at that backer data, there's 11 million data points in that thing. It's got state and country level information and dollars pledged by backers around the world. So they have a backer location data is really interesting. And then I have this little warts and all bit, because from my experience using other versions of Kickstarter data that has largely been scraped off the web, most of this data entry, or much of the at least text-based data entry, is entered by the users, by the creators of the campaigns or the projects. And you're going to find some interesting spelling in there and some strange characters, things that don't fit on the keyboard and the databases might not actually like. You're going to find some creativity in the entries there, not just in the creative content they're creating, but there's a surprisingly large number of ways to spell Milwaukee, for instance, when you get into the location fields. And so you're going to find some of these data, at least in most of the other Kickstarter data, you find some interesting locations, for instance, that aren't, for instance, specific cities. They may be neighborhoods or regions. And I think some of this sort of creative entry is actually a bit telling. And we could actually look at that data to see what people are putting in there and actually learn something from it. But that's a answer for another question we can get into later. When you think about the prior research that's been using crowdfunding data, there's thousands of papers published on crowdfunding as a phenomenon. And I suspect many of them, if not most, are actually using Kickstarter as an example of Kickstarter data. It is not just the dominant crowdfunding platform in the world, it's also the dominant crowdfunding platform among data researchers. Maybe the most dominant theme in that research using Kickstarter data is about the determinants of campaign success. So most of the researchers out there seem to be really interested in the secret to your success. And how do you launch a successful campaign? Make sure you've got lots of videos in there and launch it on a Tuesday, and these kinds of tips that people have discerned from combing through the data. And I'd like to think that many of those studies could be redone because things have changed. Kickstarter's been around a long enough time that it's evolving, but that's what a lot of this research is. And maybe secondarily, there are attached and sometimes separate themes about networks, particularly social networks or professional networks, or networks of backers and networks of creators, and thinking about the role of social capital and other kinds of capital in fostering successful campaigns, but also how these campaigns can actually, in reverse, foster more social capital or more professional development, stronger networks. So there's a big network interest, and there's also, as I'm part of, an interest in the geography of crowdfunding and where all this is taking place. And so there's big themes in a lot of this old research. There's other themes like how Kickstarter gets used for marketing and pro-social sorts of content that are out there. Again, as John mentioned, these are often really well designed for things that don't fit into the regular marketplace, that don't have simple sort of retail commercial applications. There's lots of interest in sort of biases or discrimination and questions about whether or not you see more of it or even less of it on the Kickstarter platforms. Really important questions that can be answered in some really interesting research and insights about how, for instance, women may be doing a lot better on crowdfunding platforms than they would in other conventional venture capital type settings. And then there's always an interest, and probably not enough research to talk to the external effects of crowdfunding. What happens after the campaigns, what happens after the project window closes, but also what happened prior to it that brought them there, and what are the spillovers, and how does all this happen? Like, I think there's a lot of room there to grow, and I'm excited to see where it grows next. So what can we do with this data? Well, looking at the data that's going to be up there, is up there. A lot of the crowdfunding literature out there uses two elements that aren't in the ICPSR data. First, there's a lot more descriptive content about the campaigns and about the creators that I don't think is going to actually be on the NADAC site or on the ICPSR site. And that's just means we have more work to do as the researchers. A lot of what really good research is doing that uses the Kickstarter data is connecting it to external data, whether it's post-campaign results or other contextual factors at play. And so that's work we need to do as researchers. We'll take this great data source and connect it to these external things and say even more. And so expect to be doing that when you dig into this data. And the restricted use files, when you get to those, are going to really help you be able to make those connections, I suspect. But I also want to underline this backer location data. There, in this thousands of papers studying crowdfunding and particularly using Kickstarter data, there's extraordinarily limited information about backers. We don't have a lot of studies of where backers are or who the backers are or anything like this. It is clearly the biggest gap in any of the research on it. And now Kickstarter is making available a specialized data set about backers and where they are. And this is fantastic. It's a great step, and I'm excited to see what'll come from people being able to make use of this. So even with just the basic stuff that's going to be in the main project's data file, we can do a lot. Knowing subcategories and dates and locations and so on lets us do a lot. And I'm going to show you some examples of things that make use of essentially just that data and then sometimes connecting it to some outside. But one of the first questions we asked, and this is going to be an expansion on the pie graphs that John showed about, is going to be how Kickstarter treats these different categories in a sense. Like, how do the different categories fare equally well in the Kickstarter ecosystem? And I get a lot of questions and interest from funders, for instance, who want to know if opera and dance are not going to be favored in this new world of online crowdfunding, whereas film and video might excel. They worry about sort of tilting the playing field. So here's a little graphic I cooked up, and this is not current by any means up-to-date data. It's a couple years old, but we've got blue bubbles representing the 15 main categories, and they're proportionate to the number of projects in each of those categories. So not a lot of journalism projects, but plenty of film and video projects. Now, horizontal axis, left to right here, is the average success rate in each of those bubbles, in each of those categories. And so you can see dance and theater tend to have relatively high success rates, whereas crafts and journalism, not so much. And then vertical axis is dollars raised and on the average in each of those projects. So you can see tech, games, and design stand out as their average ends up being over $20,000 per project, a lot more than the rest of the mass down here. And you can see the really large film and video and music and publishing bubbles account for a lot of the projects, and they're fairly well sort of evenly spread or in the middle of the road in terms of success. Anyway, you can get this data and pull up your own cool graphics and visualizations like this and get to know, well, how do these different categories bear out? What are they like relative to each other in terms of success and size and so on? If we unpack just the arts category, now we can look at the subcategories within arts. And this is the same kind of graphic, but now only looking at subcategories within the arts or among arts projects. So you can see ceramics tend to be really expensive projects. Public art a little cheaper. Success rates for public art projects are a lot higher on average than for textiles and digital art. And so you can see there's a lot of interesting variation within different categories. One of my favorite ones is to look within music, partly because it tells you a bit about the oddity of the internet and Kickstarter. We have a big outlier out here, which is screwing up the scale of this graph, the chiptune category, which has high average value and high success rates. Go out and start your chiptune campaign now. But there are not a lot of these, right? There haven't been in a while. And so take that one out, and then you can see across the different genres of music, things like jazz and classical and indie rock tend to have relatively high success rates. And hip hop and R&B are way at the bottom. And I think this is the kind of things that a lot of people should be really interested in, what goes on in the distribution of activities and who's on Kickstarter, what gets supported, what doesn't, and so on. So I think there's some really interesting things that we can get by just looking at the basic data. I also want to ask questions about geography. That's one of my main interests. I want to know where all this stuff is happening. Where are these projects going on? So I did a paper with Sherry Bresnitz a couple of years ago. And our first interest was to compare crowdfunding in the Kickstarter world to venture capital, which is incredibly highly spatially concentrated, geographically located in just a handful of cities. And well, we know it's going to be better than that. It's going to be more distributed than that, but is it really going to flatten the world? Crowds by their nature aren't really flat. They're highly concentrated. It's their definition. So even though we're virtual crowds, does that mean we're going to ignore where people and economic activity really are? Is crowdfunding just going to map onto that and so on? So we really wanted to see, is Kickstarter amplifying where crowds already are or dispersing it? And to do that, a couple of years ago, we got together a bunch of the data, we mapped it into a bunch of different cities, and we sort of aggregated up what kind of activities happening in each city and in what kind of categories, what's going on. And then we mapped it, and lo and behold, there's a map of bubbles, which represents dollars raised by all the different cities around the US and Canada. And it looks like it's a lot more just evenly distributed than venture capital. It's not just all in Boston and the Bay Area, but on the other hand, this map kind of just looks like a map of the population of the US. It's relatively empty in the Intermountain West because the US is relatively empty in the Intermountain West. This maps onto largely onto economic activity across the country. You can see the same thing if you look at where projects are that have lots of backers, not just necessarily lots of dollars, and the story looks roughly the same. So one of the first things we found when we started digging into this is the number of projects, not the number of backers or dollars. The number of projects is much more diffused and spread out around the country. But the number of dollars and successes tend to be much more highly concentrated in the big cities. So my quip for that was ideas are everywhere, but good ideas turn out they're in the bigger cities. Success isn't everywhere. But we were also then interested in, well, maybe there's certain different types of projects would cluster differently. Are the digital media ones, video and music and things, do they tend to be more dispersed because you can do that stuff from anywhere? It's all virtual. Whereas a restaurant project or a park or a mural, those place-based ones, maybe those are going to be more spatially concentrated. And what we ended up finding was exactly the opposite of that. On the whole, across all the Kickstarter world, it maps onto where economic activity is, income, population, and so on. And there's no real additional spatial clustering on Kickstarter. But if you narrow the analysis to look at just digital media projects, we find it maps onto economic activity, but it amplifies and concentrates it more than what you would see beyond the normal concentration of economic activity. Whereas for the more locally based projects, we actually see it diffusing more than what we would expect to see from just the natural concentration of economic activity. And our story for this is largely that digital media people who can be anywhere, the footloose entrepreneurs, because they could be anywhere, that doesn't mean that they are everywhere. It means that they move to the bigger markets and the bigger cities because they can. Whereas the local projects that are harder to relocate are differentially advantaged in the Kickstarter world, in the world of online crowdfunding. Smaller markets and medium-sized markets have a disproportionately bigger advantage from being able to raise funds through a crowdfunding platform than those already in the larger markets. And so we see a diffusion to the medium and small size markets benefiting from this kind of activity. Another project I did with Elizabeth Lazaro, we were looking more internationally. So you can map this onto the whole planet. You don't have to limit yourself just to North America. And you can see where is Kickstarter activity around the world. And then we tried to do a quick little model of what explains where it is, and things like income and speaking English, that matters. But one of the biggest things we found was that it's actually the smaller domestic markets, the smaller populations within a country were sort of disproportionately represented in Kickstarter's data, suggesting that, again, the smaller markets are benefiting more from a platform that can let them go global and reach things outside their market that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do as effectively. All right, that's a pretty static picture. I'm kind of curious about the dynamics. Where's all this geography moving? How's it changing over time? So did a couple bits of analysis on this. And the first one we wanted to look at a metro area perspective, so drain versus a brain gain kind of question. Which urban areas are gaining or losing these Kickstarter entrepreneurs, these creators? So we looked at about a little over 6,000 creators who had multiple projects on Kickstarter, and they relocated in between project number 1 and project number 2. Where did they go? Which cities gained them? Which cities were losing them? And we kind of were curious if it was just random and arbitrary because people don't think Kickstarter is all that important in their life. They're moving for other reasons like the weather or jobs, or maybe they're actually moving in much more system actually related to Kickstarter. So we come up with another cool map of metro areas that are gaining and losing, and you can see hot spots in red and cold spots in blue, red gaining people and blue losing on net. And it's literally all over the map there. You can look at a list of the cities here on the right-hand column, the metro areas that gained the most people and on net. Things like San Francisco, Nashville, Seattle, maybe the ones you might have expected, but then the net losers on the left column, Austin and Boston and San Diego, maybe not the ones you would have expected to see in both cases. So there's a volatility, and it raised the question of, is this just random? What's going on? And the bottom line of the analysis is the migrating patterns that absolutely weren't random. If anything, people were flocking to birds of a feather. They were moving to metro areas that had other Kickstarter crowdfunders already there working in their same category. They weren't just going to cities that had lots of Kickstarter activity. They were specifically going to cities that had Kickstarter activity in their category, the same category as their first project. And they weren't actually chasing relevant jobs in the same sectors. There's a little bit of difference in how music creators and film creators and other genres were moving. But it was actually the case that it's Kickstarter itself is its own phenomenon that was explaining and attracting and describing where the patterns of migration. But we also wanted to look at this from the perspective, not of the metro area, but of the creator themselves. So, and that's one of the beauties of the Kickstarter data set is that it gives you access to individual creators and individual creative ventures. And there's very few large end projects at a micro level of entrepreneurship. And so this is a great opportunity for us to ask the question, what's guiding those relocation decisions? So we started with the 25,000 creators who had multiple projects and asked them after project 1, we didn't ask them, we didn't ask the data after project number 1, do they stay or do they go? Do they relocate or do they have project number 2 in the same city? And then if they did relocate, again, those 6,000 or so, where did they relocate to? So the first question is the stay or go question. The second one is conditional on going, where are you going to go to? And let's say you were starting in San Francisco here, you've got thousands of choices of possible destinations. What explains why you picked destination 73 as opposed to the other tens of thousands? Well, we narrowed it down to about 942 different metro areas and micropolitan areas and rural areas by state and try to explain why they picked what they picked. And the first question of do you stay or do you go? Turns out if you were successful on your first project, you tended to stay. If you had more backers on your first project, a big friends and family network, you tended to stay. If you raise more money, you could afford the plane ticket, you go, right? I also found that being around similar projects in the same category as yours, there's a gravitational pull. You had to get escape velocity, get out. You were more likely to stay if you were in a community of other people doing the same kind of Kickstarter activity as you. And if they were more successful at it, regardless of your success, you were more likely to stay. And we found that if you were successful on your first project, you were even more sensitive to these sort of market indicators and signals about others' success and activity on Kickstarter. Now, for where do you go? Well, the first thing we wanted to look at was, are you attracted just to cities that have lots of Kickstarter activity, the Bay Area, New York or something? And it turns out overall Kickstarter activity didn't do much to explain where people chose as their destination, but instead Kickstarter activity in categories of their own, based on their own first project, was what described where they ended up going. They went to cities that had more people doing what they were doing, that had more successes, higher success rates of those people doing what they're doing, and had more backers for those areas. They were drawn to market size, to bigger cities, and in general, they moved closer nearby, as everyone does. We tend not to move very far away when we do move. There's some differences by different category, but there were some interesting results, I think, overall, nonetheless. Okay, post-campaign results. You can use this data to look what happens after campaigns. And this was one of my favorite studies because it took on one of my favorite categories on Kickstarter, that tabletop games area. The games section in Kickstarter is a rich community. So we looked at this partly because it's not just a rich community, there's also rich sets of external data we could link it to. Paper I did with Vincenzo Buccetti, where we looked at this games category, and at least when I pulled up the data, if you look at the average failed project on Kickstarter, it raises less than 2% of its goal, kind of as these trees falling in the woods and no one's there to notice. There's lots of them. I used to joke that, to me, the median project on Kickstarter is someone knitting sweaters for cats. And it's really creative and quirky, and probably not all that supported. But people have a chance to try out their ideas and see what sticks. The tabletop games part of Kickstarter seems to function quite a bit differently. It's a very well evolved and developed marketplace. And you've probably played some of these games or seen them on store shelves. And there's a lot of market R&D that's essentially happening on Kickstarter, where people are putting their great ideas out there, they're getting backed, and then eventually it shows up on shelves at Target. It's a really interesting and rich world. And we were very interested in this sort of top questions about what happens when you give creative control over to your backers, to your audience, to the crowd, in part because a lot of these reward levels in Kickstarter projects allow for, if you back it at a high enough level, you get a chance to influence the design of the product and have a bit of probably very minor control over the game. It's sort of like if I was marketing a version of Monopoly and you wanted to give me $1,000 as a backer, I will name Park Place after you. It will be Doug Place, if that's what you want. If you give me enough money, I'll change the game board for you. And so this idea of co-design came in here, and we were interested in that. But also there's a community here where creators have to work with their backers and answer questions and deal with complaints and interact with them. And some of these things are much more active backers than others. Some backers are much more passive, and they put their money and they wait for the thing to show up. So we were measuring how much the backers for a project were active, and then how much, based on the design of the campaign, backers had co-design control. And we wanted to look at successes in the sense, not just of making your goal, but actually getting your product to market. And if you do a tabletop game, we know whether it makes it to market or not. That's an easy one to check. And so we looked to see whether it was successful in making it to market. And we also have users who rate every one of those games. And so we have quality ratings about what came out. And one of the things we found is that appealing to the crowd and giving them co-design control, and essentially giving control over to your big backers, the big fans, the friends and fanatics, it helps it get made and make it to market. But it doesn't actually help much with quality. In fact, it hurts the quality. Maybe letting my uncle Frank design the game wasn't such a good design choice. He's not that good at it. Okay, but the other thing we found is that effect disappears once it's your second time out as a creator. So for repeat creators, you don't suffer from having to fail to manage your crowd. On your second go around, they get better at managing the crowd. And so the second go around for these creators don't suffer any of these kinds of downsides. They just are able to work with the masses and bring it to market and have better results. All right, I'm going to get to the end here. You can look at different trends in how we're funding things. I think there's big questions about how egalitarian crowdfunding is, or how egalitarian the Kickstarter funding space is. I think we should be asking questions about the distribution of resources on platforms like crowdfunding, and we have the data to answer that. I'm going to skip past some of those things to get you to one last bit of an example. When we get into some blurbs, or even just looking at the categories, the content itself of what's on in the Kickstarter data is interesting. So a colleague of mine, Alan Collins out at Nottingham Trent, during the pandemic started talking about whether or not laughter might be the best medicine, or maybe it's just too soon. And so we looked at Kickstarter data, and we wanted to see, when the pandemic strikes, do we see more or less comedy? Now, comedy is a subcategory. It's actually a subcategory of film, music, publishing, and theater. It shows up in 4 different places. And there's not a lot. There's only less than 1% of projects pre-pandemic are in the comedy, one of these comedy subcategories. If we look at the blurbs themselves, we look for funny words in there, maybe 2% invoke humor. Now, it's even less post-pandemic, so maybe it's too soon. But also, over time, there's a downward trend in any of these categories. Over time, apparently, Kickstarter is getting more and more serious. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's not. But the levity is a quickly done graphic where time is on the horizontal axis, and 2020 is this dotted green line. The red line here are non-comedy projects, the average dollars pledged. And then the blue line here is average for the comedy projects. We can see post 2020, it looks like there might be something happening there. So comedies in general are much cheaper in terms of they raise less money. It's cheaper to make a comedy than maybe some of the other things in your category, but they actually have more backers per dollar than many other comedies. So pretty popular, same success rates, generally speaking. But post 2020, we might see actually a spike in the comedy in the second quarter. These are kinds of questions. This is a bit of a silly one, perhaps, but it shows the potential of what we can do with the Kickstarter data. And so that's where I'm going to go as I close this. Most of what I showed here, you can do essentially just using the restricted use data and then linking it to a couple of things on the outside. You're going to want more Kickstarter project details, possibly, depending on what you're going to do with your research. And you're going to be able to link to that, to other data using location fields or the timestamps, or even the categories and different sectors that the projects are in, and link to external other data sources. So I think there's lots of opportunity there. And that's part of what makes this great. I think there's lots of good questions we should all be asking. Lots of questions about trends in this data, because this is a long time series data set now. The panel we've got a decade or more. We're more than a decade of this. And it's not just big N, it's covering a lot has changed since Kickstarter began. So we can learn a lot, I think. And I think the nature of essentially online or crowdfunding communities, what makes the tabletop games part different? Are there other things that are different in different ways? Are things that are similar? I think we can learn a lot about developing these kinds of communities or not developing them. We can learn a lot about the content of these campaigns, of the projects, not just sort of the text content, but other ways we might craft or think about the content of these projects. And I think we should be paying a lot of attention to the evolution of the content that's up in Kickstarter as a platform over time. Relative growth rates within and between the different subcategories, I think are interesting to look at. One of the biggest questions when we link to external data is going to be to link all of this to arts and cultural participation. I'm curious to know about how these projects, whether it's the creating of them or the backing of them, how that sort of crowdfunding behavior links to behavior of arts and cultural participation, especially when a lot of these projects are virtual and producing virtual outputs and products. Is that something that people are able to participate in? And this is something that's fostering more and more arts and cultural participation in that sense, but especially for the place-based ones as well. What's it doing for participation there? And then I think broadly, there's big questions about crowdfunding as a substitute and as a complement. In some cases, it's a better mousetrap. It substitutes for something else we were already doing. In other cases, it just amplifies and makes other things more possible. And so it can complement in some ways and substitute in others. And I think those are really interesting questions to be asking. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of people probing about downstream impacts and what happens after the fact. It was interesting for us to track what happens to these tabletop games when they make it to market. And Many of them do, and some of them don't, and some of them one day will. And Kickstarter has a bit of different categories for ability to have these creators actually deliver on products. But I think it's even more interesting to think about the reputation that Kickstarter has about not going beyond delivery of product, but its impact on the reputation and professional development of the creators, its impact on entire sort of fields of products, right? Apple Watches and exercise machines and family not so friendly card games. There's entire genres that have been inspired by and influenced by what goes on in Kickstarter. Those downstream impacts are fascinating to think about as people are developing both from the individual perspective of the creator, but also from the product line and other forms of innovation. And then the last thing I'll say here on other new questions is I'm excited to see us all dig into this backer location. Let's see a map of where all these backers are. Let's see how the location of these backers map onto other resources, onto other forms of wealth or other policies or other things, other factors. How does it map onto the location of where these projects are being cited? How does it map onto arts and cultural participation and other versions of demand for creative work? I think we have a lot we're going to see from all this, and I'm excited to dig into it. And so with that, I'm going to see we have some questions in the Q&A. I don't know what they are, but I'm going to stop talking and take a peek.
Thank you, Doug. I wish I had more time to listen to you talk about this. This is really cool. Just very quick before we get to questions, I wanted to say a few words about the data. As John and Doug mentioned, the public use Kickstarter data set is currently freely available on the NADAC website. Anyone can go and download it and hit the ground running. The restricted use Kickstarter data set is coming up, will be available soon, and it will be available via the Virtual Data Enclave, VDE, and data users will have to apply for access and sign the restricted data use agreement to be able to work with that data. And now we are happy to take your questions.
There are a number of questions in the chat that I can just sort of run through very quickly, probably. So I'm just going to take them in order. So who gets to see your Kickstarter campaign? Does Kickstarter expand our potential donors to a vast new group, or are you sending info to your current donors and audiences? The question is, where do backers come from, really? Is it coming from the creator, or is it coming from Kickstarter? And the answer is both. It's actually a very important question. It's like one of the most important questions for us and one of the most difficult things to assess. This is something that I work on a lot of, have revised very recently in a very important way. But right now, it's a mix of both, and very much depends on the project. So in tabletop games, because there's such a strong community on the platform, typically, you would see the median successful project in tabletop gets 30% of its funding through people just discovering it on Kickstarter. And so 70% is driven by the creator's marketing efforts. But that can go, that changes, depending on the project. Site-wide, I think the median successful campaign gets about 24% of its funding through what we would attribute to Kickstarter discovery. Our community discovering the project through Kickstarter channels of just like people coming to the website, people who have the app, people who subscribe to our newsletters, things like that, versus the creator's marketing. And again, wide variety. What does Kickstarter charge? Kickstarter charges nothing to list, but Kickstarter takes 5% of all successfully raised funds. There's also a credit. We use Stripe for payment processing, so there's also Stripe fees associated with payment processing. How often will the data be updated to include more years of data? So that would be more recent years, because we've already gone back to the beginning of Kickstarter time. I believe that we're trying to do this on an annual basis, is my recollection. So we will try to update on an annual basis. I don't have a lot of bandwidth. I wear a lot of hats right now. I'm trying to keep the wheels on the bus at Kickstarter.
I'll just jump in and say, I think this is an ongoing conversation between the National Endowment for the Arts, you guys and ICPSR about what's a doable cadence. So
that sounds right. Right now, all this basically just falls to me. So it's a question when I can jam it in my schedule and make sure I get past the lawyers. How long do project pages stay up? Forever. In very rare cases, we need to take them down, but we de-index unsuccessful campaigns from just Google search, but everything it remains up on the site. We think that's important to have that long-term record. Are there times of the year that influence the number of backers? Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of seasonality on the platform, very significant seasonality. There's a little bit of a summer lull, which is a little bit more pronounced in Europe, but there's a big lull actually in the Christmas time. So we're kind of the exact opposite of e-commerce, which like spikes starting around Thanksgiving, heading into Christmas, and we just start tanking in terms of activity shortly before Thanksgiving, because Kickstarter, you're not shopping for something you're going to get right away. You don't go on Kickstarter shop for something you're going to get for Christmas. So everybody's focused on like stuff they're going to get right now. And so creators don't want to launch projects. People stay off the platform. And then after the new year, we start ramping back up. So our nadir is right at New Year. New Year's Day, basically, New Year's Eve, and then we start sort of building back up. Our Kickstarter contributions considered tax deductible to nonprofit arts organizations. They certainly can be. If the creator is a nonprofit arts organization, you can issue tax deduction receipts to your backers. That's on the creator. Is there a relationship with Shark Tank? No. Although there's plenty of Kickstarter funded products on Shark Tank, there's no relationship there. Is there any way to know the relative income of the average backer? No, I mean, we have Google Analytics and stuff like that, which can give us some of those bands and numbers for our audience, but that's not data that we're sharing, nor is it data that we have that's very reliable. You can also, you might use some location data to try to get some of those things. In general, backers, particularly like our engaged backer community, people that are pledging, our baseline for an engaged backer is someone that's pledging once every 90 days, but we have people that are pledging to multiple projects every week. These are people that have disposable income. They often have a room dedicated in their house to all of the things that they acquire. They're a funny population, very generous, and just funny to hang out with because I've done events with them. Not a question, but an observation. We use Kickstarter as a nonprofit organization and raised our second 25,000 in half the time than traditional methods. So I don't know what the celerity effect is, but so this is someone who's used Kickstarter saying that they raised money more quickly than traditional methods. And this is where that sort of time window and all or nothing components kind of are mechanisms to really accelerate funding, right? It creates you're either in or out. It creates real meaningful stakes for the creator and for their community to say like, no, I'm gonna chip in here. And that's why it's also part of the reason why we keep that structure, even though people are like, I just want all the money I can possibly scrounge for a nonprofit. And I understand, but we've done research back in the day, and we haven't done it recently, but that shows that you raise significantly more money with this model than you would otherwise. But it does create risk. Will you be partnering with Art Basel again? I don't know. I'd have to ask our director of arts, Patton. I know we've done dinners at Art Basel, Miami in the past for artists, and I have no idea if we're doing it again. But thank you for the question, Herman. Can you give examples of what backers get back or awards? Okay, these are great. Yes, typically the core reward will be the thing that is being made, right? If you're making a film, it's getting a link to the film or a copy of the film. If it's Oculus Rift, you get a VR headset. You get the tabletop game, you get these things. At a lower level, it can be, at the lowest level, it tends to be just like a shout out on social media, which is barely a reward. But they might do previous versions of their book or something like that. And you might have like a digital version of the book and then like a hardcover version of the book. At really high levels, $1,000 to $10,000 is the max you can pledge. You get things that are like a producer credit on a film. You get distributor level rewards. So you're not just getting one tabletop game, you're getting 50 because you are a tabletop hobby shop owner and you actually are stocking that in your shelves. Those are you might get signed versions of it, or you get giant bundles where you're just like, a creator is putting 20 things into a single reward tier to just sort of max it out. Have we partnered with local governments to fund projects in their communities with matching funds and support initiatives that align with their cultural policies? Not with local governments, but we have started to, one of my hats, I started a program like Kickstarter called Forward Funds, originally called Patrons. We currently have kind of rebooted it with our first new Forward Fund in a while. So we are partnering with the Skull Foundation and Creative Capital, which is a nonprofit. And basically, because most of the campaigns on Kickstarter are not nonprofits, they're just individuals. Foundations cannot give money directly into campaigns on Kickstarter. These foundations are restricted in the way that they can use their money and have to give it to basically nonprofits typically. And there's also huge transaction costs anytime foundations give out money. So we created a scheme, you could call it money laundering for good, where the Skull Foundation has given a $500,000 grant to Creative Capital, and Creative Capital is a nonprofit, is using those funds to pledge into projects from BIPOC creators on Kickstarter. And what's amazing about this sort of program is that you can put small amounts of capital into a huge number of projects all over the country that are very accessible in a way that traditionally foundations and these these like New York City based nonprofits just aren't, and they can't operate this kind of scale. So we can actually provide scale to their funding and leverage small amounts of capital to help creators unlock larger amounts of capital. Just putting $1,000 into a $10,000 campaign that's all or nothing funding is really, really impactful. So there's a lot of stuff that I would actually love to know, the dynamics of putting $1,000 early into a campaign early on that first day or two, and how that changes the trajectory of their funding, if you want to research prompt. And then is there a relationship with Americans for the Arts? The arts data, not that I'm aware of. Whew, I think that was everything.
I think Doug just answered that question, right?
I added in, I mean, yeah, I don't think Kickstarter has a relationship, but you could try to relate the data to what American for the Arts is doing with their AEP studies, and based on the location and time, and see if there was a relationship between Kickstarter activity and what kinds of things Americans for the Arts is tracking. It'd be an interesting study.
There's one more question.
Oh,
about projects.
Great question. Oh man, so do projects identify as BIPOC? Yes. We have a survey in the project build process where we ask creators to identify across a number of demographic. It's opt-in, obviously, and we have to manage that data very, very carefully. And people opt in for us to share their project with Creative Capital based on that criteria. So people can opt into telling us their demographic information or not, and then can separately opt into us using that data to recommend their projects to funders, essentially. But we obviously have to manage that data very carefully because it's very sensitive. How large is the Kickstarter team? It's pretty much, it's just me. No, there's about 100 of us. I've just been at a Kickstarter for like 8 years now. And so it's 100 people at a company that is, we're operating at a scale that is pretty significant. And so, yeah, we'll go from this to a meeting about our union. I also negotiate our union contract. So I have to go do that. It doesn't make any sense. There's too many hats. My team of insights is 7 people. So I've got two data scientists, 3 researchers, 1 strategy analytics experimentation person, and that's it, and me.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you both for a wonderfully interesting presentation. You've given me lots of fun things to think about, and I want to thank the people who have joined us. A couple of people asked about whether the slides and presentation would be made available. They will. You'll get a note in your email with those once they're up. But thank you both for participating in Love Data Week 2022.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you, John and Anya.